The wind had been sharpening all day, slicing down the narrow lanes of Dravara 8's outer district until it found every gap in coat seams and scarf folds. Jonas Ruhr had walked the last stretch with his collar pulled high, boots slipping on. Patches of black ice, mind dulled from hours bent over brittle ledger pages in the archive vaults. The stairwell to his building greeted him with its usual breath rust from the railing, wet stone from the walls, and something faintly sour seeping up from the drain in the corner. The overhead lights buzzed with uneven life, flickering between, landing so that each step alternated between shadow and a tired yellow glow. His hand skimmed the cold metal as he climbed, already thinking of a pot of tea, maybe bread if he could be bothered, though more likely something cold eaten straight from a jar dot. By the time he reached the third floor, the sounds of the building had gathered in faint echoes, water gurgling through old pipes, a muffled cough behind a wall, the clatter of a pan somewhere 2 doors down. His own door stood quiet, exactly as he'd left it that morning. He slid the key into the lock, turned the deadbolt, and stepped inside with the same expectation he had every night. Stillness. But the stillness wasn't empty. She was crouched low by the stove, arms wrapped tight around herself, head bowed just enough to shadow her expression. Her eyes amber, sharp locked on him the moment the door closed behind him. Snowmelt slicked her rose-violet skin. Strands of long black hair streaked with silver blue clung wet to her cheeks. The silk wrap tied high over her chest was soaked through, clinging to her in the lamplight, and a dark skirt split to her thigh hung heavy with water. Bare feet, red and raw, pressed against the cracked linoleum. She didn't look like she had the strength to stand, but her posture was wired, ready to bolt if she had to. "I can cook," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I can clean. I can bear your children. Just don't throw me out." The words landed wrong, practiced in a way that spoke of too many repetitions to too many doors. Jonas knew that Cadence heard it before in other corners of the district, where desperation got traded for shelter. This wasn't an attempt to seduce him. It was a negotiation for survival. "How did you get in?" His voice stayed flat, even as his mind worked the angles. She nodded toward the frosted window. "Drain pipe. Ledge. Your latch was loose." He crossed to check. The steel was bent enough to shove open without much effort. Outside, the air was black with snow, the ledge barely wider than a handspan. When he turned back, she was still watching him with that measuring gaze. "Why here?" "You keep your lamp low, your curtains closed. Quiet men make fewer demands." It was too easy, how she'd read him. Jonas didn't like that, but he liked even less the way her hands trembled, not just from caution, but from cold sunk deep into the bones. Outside, the streets offered nothing but frozen doorways and wind that could empty the air from your lungs. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the stove. "Sit closer." She shifted in small, stiff movements, steam beginning to lift from her hair as she neared the heat. He took a clean towel from the cupboard and held it out. For a moment, she stared at it like it might be a trick, then reached. Her fingers brushed his ice cold. "I don't want your children," he said. Setting the kettle on the plate, that something flickered in her gaze. Relief. "You're hungry," he added. "Yes." He measured beans and cracked grain into a pot lit. The burner. She watched every movement, assessing. He noticed her feet again, red and raw. He fetched an old blanket and tossed it to her. She wrapped it around her legs without a word. "What's your name?" "Later," she said. "That's not a name. It's the only one you get for now." Jonas didn't push. As the room filled with the sharp scent of boiling coffee and grain, the air between them stayed taut, stretched between two people weighing the risk of letting the other stay. Tonight, at least, he decided, she would not go back into the cold. Morning. came pale and brittle, the frost on the window clinging like a second layer of glass. Jonas sat in the chair where he'd dozed in fits, his neck stiff. The blanket he'd pulled over himself during the night still half slipped to the floor. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the old heater and the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. She lay curled in his bed, the oversized shirt he'd given her slipping off one shoulder, her face turned toward the wall. For the first time since he'd found her crouched by the stove, she looked unguarded. He rose without a sound, crossing to the counter. The floor creaked once, and she stirred, eyes opening with a sharpness that belied the sleep still clinging to her. They found him immediately, tracking him as he reached for the dented coffee pot. "You didn't sleep much," she said, voice roughened from the cold and the night. "I wasn't the one freezing all day," he replied, measuring water into the pot. "How's your leg?" She sat up, pulling the blanket around herself. "Better than outside." Her gaze flicked toward the window latch he'd inspected the night before. "You fixed it already?" "Not yet, but I will. Don't want strangers thinking this place is easy to get into." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You haven't yet?" he said, leaning against the counter. "But I need to know if someone's going to come looking for you." "No one will." She said it fast, too fast. "That's not the same as saying no one cares where you are." "They don't," she answered, eyes dropping to the blanket. "Not anymore." It wasn't defensive, just final. He didn't push further. The coffee began to bubble, its smell cutting through the lingering scent of damp clothes. He set 2 chipped mugs on the table and poured, steam curling up between them. "I'll work for my stay," she said, wrapping her fingers around the mug. "I'm not hiring. I'm not asking for pay. I'm asking for time. Time to figure out what comes next." Her tone was calm, but there was a strain beneath it. "Not bargaining for comfort, bargaining for survival." "You cook?" "Yes, but you'll need to work with what's here. No extra rations coming in for a while." "That's fine. I've made meals with less." He didn't doubt it. She took a tentative sip, winced at the bitterness, then drank again. "You never told me what you do with the archives," she said. "I fix what's falling apart. Old records, books, maps, things the city hasn't decided to burn yet. Why bother? No one out here cares about old paper." "That's why someone has to," he said. "Memory disappears fast enough without help." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she returned to her coffee. When it was gone, she rose and began rinsing the mugs at the sink without being asked. He noticed the way her eyes drifted toward the door, twice, not with panic, but with a habitual scan, the kind a person makes when escape routes are second nature. "Lion," he said, trying her name for the first time. She glanced back over her shoulder. "If you stay, it's not for one night. If I let you in once, it's not to watch you freeze tomorrow." She set the mugs down, water dripping from her hands, and faced him fully. "Then you'd better be sure you can live with me here." He thought about it longer than he expected. "I'll fix the window today. After that, we'll see." A quick, almost imperceptible nod. She turned back to the stove, adding a piece of kindling to the fire. The light caught in her hair, and the room felt warmer, though Jonas wasn't ready to decide if it was just the stove dot. The wind outside rose and fell like a restless tide, rattling loose siding somewhere down the alley. By mid-afternoon, the heater gave a low groan and died, leaving the stove as their only defense against the creeping cold. Jonas stood over it, feeding in narrow sticks of split wood, feeling the warmth bloom slowly against his shins. Behind him, Lion dragged the small table closer, the legs scraping on the warped floorboards. 2 blankets were laid out near the stove, one for sitting, one to pull over them when the night came on harder. "It's warmer here," she said simply, straightening from her work. He didn't argue. The bed was too far from the heat, and there was no telling how long it would be before the landlord bothered to repair the heater. She covered a bowl of dough and set it beside the fire, the scent of yeast already faint in the air. They ate bread later with leftover stew, sitting cross-legged on the blankets in front of the flames. The glow painted her skin in shifting tones, rose deepening to bronze where shadow touched it. She sat with her knees drawn close, fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic bowl. "You didn't tell me," she said after a while. "Tell you what?" "That you lived here before the district started falling apart." He glanced at her, weighing his reply. "How do you know I did? You don't move like someone who came in after. You don't scan every doorway. You know where the cracks in the street are before you step." She gave a small shrug. "It's the way locals walk." He let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "Born 3 blocks over. Family's gone now." She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned back on her hands, letting the firelight play along the faint opalescent sheen of her skin. "You're not asking me where I came from," she said. "You'll tell me if you want to." Her gaze lingered on him, longer than usual, as if testing whether he meant it. Then she looked back at the fire. The wood popped softly, sending a curl of sparks up the iron throat of the stove. Jonas added another stick, the warmth seeping into the thin air between them. When he sat back down, she shifted slightly closer, enough that her knee brushed his. Through the blanket. She didn't move away. "Where I was before," she said. "No one sat this close unless they wanted something." He kept his eyes on the fire. "And you think I want something?" "I think you're not sure yet." Jonas turned his head toward her then. She was watching him without challenge, only observation, as though she'd already decided she could live with either answer. "Maybe I am," he said. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but near enough to shift the air. The blanket slid from her knees, bearing a length of skin to the fire's glow. The heat between them was no longer just from the stove. She leaned into him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. The sound of the wind outside became distant, softened by the steady burn of the fire and the quiet weight of her against him. For the first time since she'd climbed through his window, the contact carried no tension, only the choice to stay where she was. "If you want, I can carry this same tone into the next part of the story, where she begins to open up about her past and they share their first moment of real trust. That would lead naturally into Chapter 4's turning point. Would you like me to continue straight into that?" The fire had burned low by the time Jonas realized how long they'd been sitting in silence. Lion's head was still against his shoulder, her breathing slow, but not yet the deep rhythm of sleep. Outside, the wind prowled along the building's edges, testing every seam, but the latch he'd repaired earlier in the day held firm. When she finally stirred, it wasn't to move away. Instead, she shifted to face the stove, drawing the blanket higher across her legs. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire when she spoke. "You asked me yesterday if someone might come looking for me." Jonas waited. "The truth is, they won't, but not because they don't know where I am." He didn't answer, letting her decide how much she wanted to give him. "I left the place I was working. It wasn't work anyone chose. You did." "What?" "They told you. Slept where they put you. No chains, but you didn't survive long outside." "I lasted longer than most." She brushed a strand of hair from her face, fingers lingering against her cheek. "When I walked away, I didn't run. I just kept moving until I found somewhere no one recognized me. Somewhere no one asked questions." Jonas could see the flicker of memory in her eyes. No fear now, but the echo of it. "They'll let me disappear," she went on. "Easier than bringing me back. But disappearing means you don't stay anywhere long enough to matter." Her gaze lifted from the fire, meeting his. "Until now." He rose slowly, crossing to the counter and pouring water into the pot. The hiss of the stove filled the pause between them. "And you're telling me this because I want you to know I didn't choose your place just because it was warm. I saw the way you treated what's in here." She gestured toward the stacks of books, the drying line of ledger pages near the wall. "If you take care of that, maybe you'd take care of someone like me without turning it into a debt I can't pay." The kettle began to whisper. Jonas poured coffee into 2 mugs and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, eyes closing briefly as the warmth seeped in. "I don't make promises I can't keep," he said. "I'm not asking for promises," she replied. "I'm asking for a chance to stay still for longer than a night or two." They drank in silence, the words settling between them. When the mugs were empty, she rose and carried them to the sink. Jonas watched as she rinsed them, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. She didn't glance at the door this time. When she turned back toward him, something in her stance had shifted, less coiled, less prepared to flee. Jonas stood, the weight of a decision sitting squarely in his chest. He crossed the small space between them. She didn't step back. The firelight caught the amber in her eyes, steady and clear. He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm, light, enough that she could turn away if she wanted. She didn't single quotes T. Her voice was quiet, almost careful. "If I stay here, it can't be like the other places I've stayed." "It won't be," Jonas said, and the certainty in his own tone surprised him. She searched his face for a moment longer, then closed the distance between them. Her hands came to rest lightly on his forearms, as if confirming he was real. When he leaned down, his forehead touched hers first, their breath mingling in the space between, and then her lips met his slow, deliberate, unhurried. The kiss was not about claiming. It was about allowing that when they parted. She stayed close. "If you change your mind," she murmured, "tell me before I find out another way." "I won't change my mind." And in that moment, he knew it was the truth. Days bled into each other, stitched together by small, deliberate acts that neither of them named. The cold still ruled Dravara 8's outer district, but inside Jonas's apartment the air carried the constant undertone of wood smoke and cooking, sometimes thin stews stretched over 2 days. Sometimes bread that left the room warm, long after it was gone. Jonas found himself working faster at the archives, moving through warped bindings and brittle paper with more focus. The thought of returning to the apartment, less a retreat from the world and more an arrival. Lion was always there when he came in, moving through the narrow rooms without the cautious, coiled manner she'd had at first. She no longer checked the door when she crossed the space, no longer kept the blanket draped around her shoulders like a shield. It sat folded over the back of a chair now, kept for the coldest hours, not for defense. He'd wake to the quiet sound of her steps in the kitchen, the clink of mugs before the smell of coffee drifted in. Sometimes she was mending a seam in the skirt she'd repaired weeks ago, sometimes tending a pot on the stove, sometimes bent over the table shaping dough with the sleeves of her shirt rolled high. She moved like she belonged there, like the walls recognized her. The market became part of their rhythm, too. The vendors stopped calling her stranger. They nodded in passing, greeted her in half-smiles. She knew which stalls would give her a better price and which to avoid altogether. Once, Jonas caught her trading a bundle of dried greens for a small tin of powdered spice. A quiet exchange done without a word. She didn't explain, but the next night the stew had a depth of flavor that lingered long after the bowls were emptied. It was a slow settling, but one day Jonas realized the thought of her leaving didn't even cross his mind. He caught himself watching her at the table, fingers dusted with flour, her head tilted slightly as she listened to the pop of the fire. When she laughed unguarded, head tipping back at something he said about a market vendor's crooked scale. He realized he'd never heard that sound from her before. Later, as the fire burned low, she sat across from him, legs curled beneath her, mending a loose button on one of his shirts. The lamplight caught the opalescent sheen of her skin in fleeting patterns as she worked. "You've made it hard to imagine this place without you," he said without quite meaning to. Her hands paused, needle hovering over the fabric. When she looked up, her eyes held something warm beneath the steady amber. "This feels like the first place I belonged," she said, and it was not a light statement. Jonas didn't answer right away. The truth of it hung in the space between them, mingling with the soft scent of wood smoke and bread. The fire cracked once, and she smiled faintly before returning to her work. Outside, the frost still pressed against the window, but in here, it felt like they'd built something the cold couldn't touch. The morning broke with a thin wash of light filtering through the frost on the window, a cold so sharp it made the glass hum faintly in its frame. Jonas had been up early, stacking the last of the kindling near the stove, while the smell of yeast from last night's bread still lingered. Lion was at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, shaping dough with slow, steady movements. The rhythm of her hands was as familiar now as the crackle of the fire. He leaned against the counter, watching her work. She didn't look up. "You're staring," she said, her tone light. "Maybe I am." "Why?" "Because you look like you've been here forever." She gave a faint smile at that, her hands never pausing. "Feels like I have." The bread went into the oven, and they sat together while it baked, talking about nothing urgent, whether the weather might break before the week was out, whether they should trade for more salt, what she'd make for dinner tomorrow. It was the kind of conversation neither of them would have imagined sharing when she first climbed through his window. When the bread was ready, they ate it still warm, butter melting into the crust. She laughed again, that same unguarded sound he'd only recently learned, at something he said about a vendor's impossible promises. The room felt full in a way that made him forget about the winter pressing in outside. But when she cleared the table, there was a different weight in her expression. She hesitated near the counter, her hands folded together as though to keep them still. Jonas set down the knife he'd been using to cut the bread and straightened. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He studied her, reading the seriousness in her voice. "All right." She took a slow breath, her eyes fixed on his. "I'm pregnant." The words landed heavily, cutting through the quiet. For a moment he didn't move, not from shock, but because he understood the weight behind her saying it. She hadn't come here expecting to build a life. Certainly not to start one. He stepped closer, resting his hands gently on her arms. "How long have you known?" "A few days. I waited because I wasn't sure how you'd take it. You thought I'd tell you to leave?" Her eyes softened, though a trace of uncertainty lingered. "It's happened before. Not with you, before. And not always in words." "You're not leaving," he said, the firmness in his voice leaving no room for doubt. She let out a slow breath, as though she'd been holding it since the moment she found out. "I didn't think I wanted this. Not here. Not now. But when I found out, I didn't feel afraid the way I thought I would. Because you're not alone this time." For the first time since she'd arrived, she let him see her without that thin shell of self-protection. She leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his chest. His arms closed around her, holding her as though nothing outside those walls could touch them. They stayed like that for a long time. The only sounds the burn of the fire and the faint hiss of the oven cooling. When she finally stepped back, there was a new steadiness in her eyes. "This place," she said quietly, "it's not just yours anymore." Jonas glanced toward the frost-blurred window, then back to her. "It never was, not since the night you came in." That night, they sat by the fire, speaking in low voices about what would change, what wouldn't, and how they would make room for the life that was coming. Outside, the district was still cold and indifferent. Inside, the warmth between them felt real, and now it had a future. The weeks that followed carried a quiet, deliberate rhythm, as if both of them were guarding something fragile from the cold outside. Jonas worked the archives with a sharper efficiency, his mind never straying far from the thought of the apartment of her waiting at the end of the day. Lion moved through their shared space with an ease that had taken root so deeply. Seemed impossible she'd ever been poised to run. The market vendors knew her by sight now. Some greeted her with nods, others with brief exchanges in the clipped dialects that threaded Dravara 8's outer district together. It was on one of those market days, when Jonas had been repairing the warped spine of a tax ledger, that the knock came. Sharp, deliberate 3 beats, pause 2 more. He opened the door to find a man in a weathered coat, eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. The stranger's gaze slid past Jonas immediately, fixing on Lion, where she stood by the stove. He spoke to her in a language Jonas didn't know, and measured. Lion's reply was brief. Whatever passed between them was quick, unadorned, and ended with the man giving a slight nod before stepping back into the hall. The sound of his boots faded down the stairwell. Jonas closed the door, the weight of the latch clicking home louder than usual. "Friend of yours?" She was still by the stove, hands braced lightly on the edge of the counter. "No." "Then, what was he?" Her eyes lifted to his, steady but not without hesitation. "Someone from before." He waited, silent, until she let out a breath and turned fully toward him. "When I told you, I left a place I didn't choose. That was only part of it. It wasn't just workhouses. There's a system, quiet and deliberate, where women like me are placed traded to human districts, breeding stock to strengthen the next generation. Not official, not on paper, but it happens all the same." Jonas's jaw tightened, though his voice stayed level. "And the offer you made that first night, I can bear your children." It wasn't just desperation. Her gaze didn't waver. It was what I was taught to say when there was nowhere left to go. It kept me alive, even if it meant losing something else. He crossed to the table, leaning his hands on the scarred wood. "The child," her voice came quieter now, but it carried an edge of something raw. "The child is yours. That shouldn't be possible. After what they did to us, we were told natural conception was unlikely." A pause, the faintest tremor. In her tone. "They didn't just fail to break me. They failed to take that away." For a moment the fire seemed louder than either of them, its snap and shift filling the air. Jonas stepped toward her slowly, closing the space until he could rest his hands on her arms. "Then we raised them here," he said, his voice steady. "And they never know the world that did that to you." Lion's breath caught not from doubt, but from the sudden absence of the weight she'd carried. She leaned into him, her forehead finding its place against his collarbone. Outside, the frost still webbed the window, the wind still curled. Through the alleys, and Dravara 8 remained the same unfeeling sprawl it had always been. But in here, the fire burned steady, and the future improbable, defiant, and entirely their own had begun.